Welcome today to a discussion of early Christianity. And interestingly enough, we'll be talking about creativeness and how you can creatively deal with change. There were many transitions in early Christianity, and by that I mean those few years that immediately followed the death of Jesus Christ. There was a change in geography. We have to remember that throughout Christ's life, he lived only in the area surrounding Jerusalem and in the Galilee. And of course, most of the success later on came outside of that area that was known to the Romans as Judea and Palestine. Jerusalem, later on, ceased to be the center of the church, and that's because the Romans drove both the Christians and the Jews from the city and forced a shift in the place where the Christians had their strength. Obviously, also throughout that period, we see that Paul roamed the entire Mediterranean, converting people throughout that entire Mediterranean basin, and as he did so, the population centers of the church moved outward from Palestine. In addition, we see a change in the sociological makeup of the church. Originally, most of the church members were relatively simple folk who lived in a backward part of the Roman Empire. They were fishermen and farmers and a few city dwellers, but not too many. But as Paul started to move throughout the Mediterranean basin, he converted mostly people who lived in cities. And therefore we see a shift from a rather rural or small town kind of population mix to a very urbanized church. Another transition in the early church was in the language. We think that Christ spoke a language that was called Aramaic, a type of Hebrew derivative language. But with Paul moving throughout the Mediterranean area, the language of the church quickly evolved to Greek. And in fact, we see that the Old Testament was written in Greek, and therefore Greek became the language of communication between the various parts of the early Christian church. In addition to that, there was a cultural change. The first members of the Christian church were Jewish, but with Paul's conversions outside of Palestine and Judea, we see a definite move to a Gentile church. And of course, there's some difficulties between the Gentiles and the Jews, and part of that had to be resolved, and we'll talk about that as we go through this discussion today. Well, there were some problems, for sure, when the church was just beginning. One of those problems was persecution from the Jews. The most obvious persecution from the Jews was, of course, the death of Jesus Christ. But there were others. Paul himself was a persecutor, and he stood by as Stephen was stoned. There were many others who were persecuted because of their belief. The Jews were quite intolerant of the Christians, and they did everything they could to try and stamp out this new religion. The next is that there was no reference text on which to base Christian teaching. There were no scriptures in the early part of the church. The New Testament, in fact, was assembled about 5th century. So you see, for a long time there was no codified Christian teaching in terms of a document. There were scriptures of sorts. They were the letters of Paul, which were the very first things in the New Testament that were created. And then the Gospels were created over the next 50 years or so, but certainly they were not widespread. This was, of course, long before the printing press, and every letter had to be copied and recopied as it was circulated throughout the membership of the church. That just made things very, very difficult. There were also disagreements among the leaders of the church. Paul represented for instance, the side that was very much in favor of Gentiles joining the church. There were others on the other side. In particular, James, the brother of Christ, was a leader of those who wanted to protect the Jewish traditions. One has to remember that the Gentiles ridiculed many of the Jewish beliefs. They ridiculed Jewish abhorrence to eating pork. They ridiculed the ritual washings and all of the other ritualistic behaviors that the Jews went through. They thought that the Jews were standoffish when the Jews refused to eat with the Gentile Christians, because from the Jewish point of view that might contaminate them and make them unclean, at least for a day. And so this difficulty rose to a few points of conflict between the leaders who favored the Gentiles and the leaders who favored the Jewish point of view. Let's take a look at a video now, and we can see that contrast in a little more detail.
I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel preached by me, Paul, is not from human origin, for I did not receive it from a man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ.
Some 300 miles north of Jerusalem, in the Roman city of Antioch, the Apostle Paul and his colleague Barnabas were working fervidly to spread the Jesus movement. Paul was a latecomer to the cause. He was an educated Jew from outside Judea and dedicated to bringing news of Jesus beyond the Jewish community. Preaching in synagogues, Paul sought converts among the non-Jews or Gentiles in the audience, and the more he succeeded, the more conflict he sparked. Many Jews worried that Paul's outreach efforts would anger the pagan majority. Others thought he was corrupting Jewish traditions. Paul had fallen under attack, and his Gentile mission soon fell under scrutiny by James and the leading Jesus followers back in Jerusalem.
Paul, preaching in the synagogues of Damascus or Antioch, would have called attention to the early Jesus movement. James is worried about Paul, and well he should have been.
Before long, some members of James' inner circle traveled north to see Paul's activities firsthand. It would be a dramatic encounter. When they reached Antioch, Luke says, they made a startling demand.
Some who had come down from Judea were teaching the brothers that if you are not circumcised in the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. This led Paul and Barnabas to enter into no small disagreement and debate with them.
The visitors demanded Paul's Gentile recruits convert to Judaism. Paul bridled in anger. The very idea, he insisted, ran counter to God's explicit instructions. Paul claimed that God had told him that Gentiles should enter his kingdom without first becoming Jews. Paul stormed to Jerusalem, intent on asserting this view to James and the other Jesus followers living there.
I left for Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus with me. I went in response to a revelation to ensure that I was not running or had not run in vain.
Paul set out on an arduous journey, taking along a fellow Jesus follower, a non-circumcised Gentile named Titus. They traveled some 2 weeks across harsh terrain to a city Paul had not seen in 14 years. His rapport with Jerusalem leaders must have been weak. But Paul himself was forceful.
Then, in private, I laid before those who seemed to be in charge the good news that I proclaim among the Gentiles.
Peter was back in the city. Speaking to him, James, and some others, Paul stated his case against circumcision for men like Titus. God didn't restrict his kingdom to Jews or Jewish converts, he said. God wanted a united movement of Jew and Gentile together. A few Jerusalem stalwarts angrily dissented. Arguments about circumcision symbolize different visions of God's plan and different visions of how to face the wider world.
In this debate, it may help us to appreciate where the different players are coming from. Let's remember that Peter and James are both from Galilee. They're from the sticks. Their perspective is somewhat limited, shall we say. Paul comes from the diaspora. He's seen the world. He comes from a wider part of the world and has a sense of the difference of those peoples out there.
It is not clear how the dispute was resolved. Luke says that Peter rose to support Paul's position, that the rock lived up to his name by becoming a stepping stone between the two camps. Whatever was said, Titus escaped circumcision. And as the followers of Jesus parted company, James and the others made a deal that seemed to confirm Paul's special mission to the Gentiles.
They gave their right hands of fellowship to me and Barnabas, acknowledging that we would go to the Gentiles and they would work with the circumcised. They only stressed one point, that we should remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do.
Remember the poor. It seemed a simple gesture of shared values.
Certainly we can see that Paul's work changed a Jewish Christian church to a Gentile church. There were problems over the common meals, the forced change from a Jewish-oriented church because they could not exclude people from meals. In addition to that, there were many other diverse beliefs that proliferated within the Gentile community because of various local beliefs and concepts which people didn't know if they should continue with those beliefs or not, as the entire the entire Christian theology was not well outlined. Here we see a picture of some symbols that are used to designate ancient Christians. One was the Chi Rho, the Chi being the Greek word CH, the letter, and that stood for Christos, and then the Rho stood for king. And so that was an early symbol. That was the symbol, in fact, that Constantine used as he conquered and became the Roman emperor. Another one is fish. The fish was a symbol because fish in Greek was an acronym for Jesus Christ, ruler of the world. I'm not sure exactly what the acronym stood for, but when you take the first of those letters, it spells out the Greek word for fish. And then anchor was a subtle reference to the same fish concept, but also a concept that Christ was the anchor of the church and the anchor of our salvation. Still, in the first century, we see that modern Christianity was very, very diverse. Bart Ehrman, who was a professor at the University of North Carolina, he said, modern Christianity is widely diverse, but this diversity is mild in comparison with Christianity during the first 3 centuries. Most people don't realize that there was so much diversity in early Christianity. It appears to have existed from the very beginning. Even among the apostles, there was a difference of opinion. And Christian sects were divided on very fundamental issues, such as the covenant, the nature of salvation, the nature of the Godhead, and so on. And for the first century at least, and probably for most of the second century, no single doctrine appeared to have power over the others. It did not dominate. For a while, all of these doctrines kind of floated among the members of the church, with individuals adhering to whatever belief set they wanted. Here, for instance, is a chart that shows some of the beliefs and some of the diversity among Christians within that first century or two. For instance, what is the nature of the divine sonship of Jesus Christ? One extreme would say that he was the literal Son of God. Another more moderate position was that he was an adopted son. And then there would be another position, mild, that he was a figurative son. Another belief that was quite diverse in the way people perceived it was the nature of Christ. Was he divine? That would be one point of view. Is he part divine, part God, and part man? That would be another, the hybrid view. Those people were called Diophysites. Or was Christ just human, merely a prophet? Another point of contention in belief was the number of gods. Some said that there were 3, or perhaps even more. Some said 2, and some said 1. With respect to the saving power, some said that Christ had given us an atonement that saved all of us. Others said that there was secret knowledge. These were the Gnostics, and they believed that with this secret knowledge one could gain eternal life. And finally, others believed that Christ merely gave us moral teachings, as a prophet would do. The Scriptures, some believed that only the Gospels and perhaps Paul would be appropriate as Scriptures. Others said that only the New Testament would be appropriate, and that would include other books besides the Pauline epistles and the Gospels. And yet others believed that both Old and New Testament should be counted as Scriptures. And finally, the rites of the church, or the ordinances, if you wish. Some believed that both Jewish and Christian ordinances should be preserved. Others said that the Jewish ordinances should be gone and only Christian ordinances used. And still others said that there was no need at all for any kind of rite or ordinance in the church. The question of authority is also a critical one in the early church. Let's see how that authority progressed as we go through this first century. Initially, Jesus chose 12 apostles. He was certainly the core, and the apostles were around him as helpers and assistants. They also, of course, became leaders of the church upon the death of Christ. Then, somewhat later, the church grew with local authorities called elders and deacons, perhaps other local authorities as well. We call this the apostolic church because the apostles still remained the core of the church, but they went about ordaining local officials. Later, we see that the apostles were dead and others had to take over control of the center of the church, becoming the main authorities of the church. The ones who did that were the bishops, the principal local leaders, and they had to help them priests and deacons. Therefore, in the post-apostolic church, bishops became more important than anything else. And so we see a change in authority from Christ through the apostles to the bishops, and that change may or may not have been fully authorized by God. Now, let's just consider, by way of discussion, some questions. How did the Jewish persecution affect the Christians? Was this persecution devastating? Well, certainly it was in the case of the death of Christ. But afterward, there was great persecution, but somehow the Christians managed to survive the Jewish persecution. They actually gathered strength, of course, outside of Palestine and Judea, but even within that area, we have instances of several thousand Christians joining, and therefore they seem to have been able to progress even in spite of this Jewish persecution. Well, but then let's ask, what about the Roman persecution? How did that affect the Christians? The Roman persecution was spotty. Initially, it was under the Emperor Nero, about 66 AD. He is the one who's responsible for the death of the apostles Peter and Paul. And because he blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome, which occurred during his tenure as emperor, he crucified many Christians and persecuted them severely. But after Nero, there was a period of time of relative peace for the Christians. They grew at a normal pace, probably being baptized one at a time, but eventually, over the next 200 years, they became quite powerful. And then the Emperor Diocletian decided that Christians were a menace to the empire because they would not unify with the pagans and have a unified religion, which he very much wanted. Therefore, he began a systematic persecution of the Christians. And in some places it was very severe. This is when most of the Christian deaths in the Colosseum occurred, and many other places throughout the empire. But there were places where the local leaders chose to simply ignore what the emperor said and not persecute the Christians severely. Therefore, we see this spotty nature. Again, through that whole thing, the Christians survived, although they may not have flourished as much as they would have otherwise. Now, let's move to the 2nd century. The 2nd century became a serious problem because there was, in essence, no record of early Christianity during the first 50 years, at least, of the 2nd century. We have no written record to speak of, certainly no scriptures, the last scripture being written about the year 100, and therefore from 100 to 150, there just simply is almost nothing. It was probably also during this period when great unrighteousness entered into the church. Later writers looking back at that period describe the onset of wickedness among the members of the church, and that may have been one of the causes for falling away from the truth. One of those writers of a later period is someone that I would like to focus on in this discussion. His name is Eusebius. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He was a famous writer. He wrote a book called The Ecclesiastical History, and it is, of course, the history of the church. He lived in the 4th century in Caesarea, Caesarea being a city in Palestine. It was a Roman city, hence the name. It was a seaport city, and it was quite cosmopolitan. Eusebius was a bishop, and quite a faithful Orthodox bishop. That is, he believed in the standard teachings of the church. We'll find out more about what Orthodox means in a moment. But in addition to that, he was invited to become the scribe, or if you like, the historian, for the first major council of the church that was held in the city of Nicaea. So he was well respected by emperors, by other church officials, and by later historians. So I will quote extensively from History of the Church by Eusebius, and I think we can gain some insights into what has happened during the first 3 or 4 centuries of the church from what he has said. He talks about the apostasy, a loss of keys, a loss of direct power and authority, how some officers are elected, but not by an authorized previous authority, not by an apostle, for instance, and perhaps not even by a bishop, but they were just simply elected by the members of the church in general, or perhaps by elders. And certainly, after the death of most of the apostles, or the scattering of the apostles to do missionary work, we see almost no apostolic oversight on who is to be an official in the early Christian church. So now let's read what Eusebius said about one of the instances of how the authority was passed on. He said, "When James the righteous had suffered martyrdom, like the Lord, and for the same reason, Simeon, the son of his uncle Clopas, was appointed bishop. He being a cousin of the Lord, it was the universal demand that he should be the second." So here we see a universal demand. He was either elected or appointed by a kind of agreement among the people. And he was chosen because he was related to the family of church stalwarts. But here's another interesting quote from Eusebius. Let's read it. "But when the sacred band of the apostles had in various ways reached the end of their life, then godless error began to take shape through the deceit of false teachers who, now that none of the apostles was left, threw off the mask and attempted to counter the preaching of the truth by preaching the knowledge falsely so called." So Eusebius points out exactly what we would fear, that because the apostles are no longer able to oversee the church, that certain teachers spring up and they start to teach unauthorized or personal beliefs. Remember now, in the early part of the church, there was a wide diversity of feeling about almost all of the major principles of doctrine in the church. And we see that here Eusebius is saying that much of it was done falsely. It was, in fact, the beginning of the apostasy, or perhaps an indication that the apostasy was already well underway. There were some doctrinal changes that occurred during this period, even in the parts of the church that started to become the most orthodox or the most accepted. In this second century, there were some who took it upon themselves to begin to say what was the accepted or orthodox doctrine of the church. These men are called the church fathers. They are officials of the church who, for one reason or another, have written documents that have survived. Some of these church fathers are viewed as being saintly by the Catholic Church, and therefore their writings are viewed as being authoritative. Much of this early Christian doctrine that was solidified into an orthodox position was based on Greek philosophy. It was Plato and Aristotle, but principally Plato, who had such power over these people. Remember that part of the Roman Empire was Stoic in their orientation and belief, and Stoicism was based strongly on the philosophies of Plato. Those who dissented from what started to become gathered together as an accepted or orthodox position, those who dissented were called heretics, and they were persecuted by other members of the church. Isn't it interesting that even though there is minimal persecution from the Jews and occasional persecution from the Romans, now within the church there is very strong persecution from one group toward another simply because of a difference in belief. There's an incident or a series of incidents, a period of time that I have called War of the Bishops. We'll talk more about that, but it has to do with who will be elected bishops, especially in some of the key population and intellectual centers of the church. There is also an interesting phenomena that we will talk about at great length, and that is the emergence of an imperial church. That is a church headed by not ecclesiastical authorities, but by political authorities, in particular the emperor of the Roman Empire. And finally, there is a rise of church councils, and how those church councils became equal in authority to individuals and equal in authority to the Scriptures, and how the councils then began to define the doctrine of the church from an authoritative standpoint. Again, after the apostles had died, we see what is called the post-apostolic church. There are two groups here that I've already mentioned one. Let's mention both of them now in context. There were some ancient church leaders, very, very early, who knew the apostles. They were personally acquainted with the apostles. These church leaders are called the Apostolic Fathers. And to some extent, if they wrote, and not too much came from them, but if they wrote, their writings were considered to be authoritative because simply they knew the apostles, and therefore whatever they wrote must be correct. The second are the church fathers, those that I've already mentioned, and they continued up till about the year 500. They wrote apologies or defenses for the church, and they also denounced heresies. So as they would define in their own mind what was orthodox, they would try and denounce everyone who was not in agreement with the orthodox or the right belief. There were also some problems, as I've previously mentioned, because there was no written doctrine of the church during the early part of the church, even up into the 3rd or 4th century. Eusebius tells us some of the problems with this lack of scriptural definitiveness, or if you like, lack of canon. Let's read what Eusebius says. In their eagerness to find not a way to reject the depravity of the Jewish scriptures, but a means of explaining it away, they resorted to interpretations which cannot be reconciled or harmonized with those scriptures. What he's saying, of course, is that there were doctrines presented that were not in harmony with the Jewish scriptures, that is, the Old Testament. Some, remember, didn't agree with the Old Testament and refused to call it part of the Scripture. Others just simply deviated from the Old Testament and ignored what the Old Testament said. Eusebius also comments about the rise of Greek power through some teachers, in particular a teacher in Alexandria named Origen. Eusebius said, in his, Origen's life, he behaved like a Christian, defined the Jewish law. In his metaphysical and theological ideas, he played the Greek, giving a Greek twist to foreign tales. He associated himself at all times with Plato, which taught him the allegorical method of interpreting the Greek mysteries, a method he applied to the Jewish scriptures. So here we see a strong academic backing for Plato's doctrine in the person of Origen. Another interesting part of the Christian church is Gnosticism. Gnostics are people who believe that there is secret knowledge, and if that knowledge is not known, then salvation cannot be brought. Sometimes that knowledge has to do with the story of the creation. Sometimes it's supported by apocryphal or hidden books. We know of the Apocrypha to the Old Testament. It's found in some Bibles. There are also a group of books, perhaps a dozen of them, that are called the Apocryphal New Testament books. And the Gnostics had certain of those Apocryphal New Testament books that contained certain secret knowledge or hinted at certain secret knowledge that the Gnostics were aware of and that led to their increased knowledge and perhaps increased chance of salvation. The Gnostics sometimes favored a belief in God that he had two strongly different aspects. One was loving, and they pointed to the way God is perceived by many in the New Testament, and one who was harsh, and they pointed to the God of the Old Testament. So Gnostics did not believe in the same nature of God, but they said God had two different natures. The Gnostics were strong believers that matter, that is, physical things are a source of evil. That would be a Platonic belief for sure. Some of the Gnostics were intellectuals, and they approached their beliefs from a philosophical standpoint. Others grew to be magical in their belief, and they approached things from an occult standpoint. Whatever group the Gnostics were in, they were, as a group, labeled as heretics, labeled as a cult, and they were denounced by many of the church fathers. But their influence was quite strong. And at the time that decisions were being made about what is to be orthodox doctrine, these Gnostics almost split the church in half. They were very powerful and may have been one of the strongest influences on the early church. Another incredibly powerful influence is called Arianism, named after a fellow named Arian who was from Egypt. He was a monk and a bishop in Egypt and became very influential. He believed that Christ was created by the Father. That is, the Father and Christ are separate beings, and that Christ was corporeal on earth but gave up his body when he became a God, that is, after resurrection. And Arianism held that this dual beings was perfectly acceptable under the Scriptures because one God, God the Father, was supreme over God the Son, who became God after the resurrection. This belief was very, very popular in Egypt, and for many years was popular among the Germans after they had become converted to Christianity. Of all of the heretics' beliefs, this one was persecuted most severely. Many Arians were just simply murdered because of their belief. Now let's move to the 3rd century and the war among the bishops. There were, in the 3rd century, 3 principal sources of power in the Christian church. One was Rome, only because of its political power as the center of the Roman Empire. The second was Alexandria, and that's because it was the intellectual capital of the Roman Empire, and it's where several very influential Christian professors held a school for Christian belief. The third was Jerusalem, and it was the headquarters of the church from the beginning, and it was, of course, the ecclesiastical headquarters of the church. But in 66 AD through the year 70 AD, and then again in 125 AD, the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and cast out many of the Jews, first in the 70 AD period, and then finishing it off in the 120 AD period. And during that period, the church in Jerusalem was just simply forced to flee. Well, where would they go? The largest city that church members could easily go to was Antioch. Antioch in Syria was the headquarters of the Roman Empire in the east, and therefore it was a very large city and a cosmopolitan one, therefore one where the Christians could probably go without too much worry. We see that the Apostle Paul, upon the end of each of his journeys, returns back to Antioch. So that was the basis for the Pauline missionary trips. Well, the war between the bishops then had to do principally with who was going to be bishop in those very, very important cities. One of the issues with appointing bishops or ordaining bishops is who would choose the bishop. In the absence of the apostles, it was resolved that the local leaders, or in some cases the entire local membership, would just simply vote on the bishop. Well, who could nominate the bishops? It was agreed that anybody who wanted to run as bishop or who felt that they had a calling as bishop could ask the elders to nominate them. But in some cases, other bishops from other parts of the church would nominate a local bishop. And that brought a problem in Alexandria in the most obvious example of the war between the bishops. Let me set the scene for you. Alexandria at the time had 2 very powerful teachers, Clement of Alexandria and his student Origen, the man that we've already talked about. These two very powerful church leaders were actually not ordained, not part of the priesthood. They were simply professors at the Library of Alexandria, which was like a university. Well, Alexandria was an intellectual center, the intellectual center of the church, and therefore it was an important place to have a very powerful bishop. The Bishop of Rome decided that he wanted one of his friends to be the Bishop of Alexandria. So the Bishop of Rome nominated his friend, and others, locals in Alexandria, nominated another person. The other person was supported by both Clement and Origen against the nominee of the Bishop of Rome. There was a discussion, there were long debates, and eventually a vote was taken. The winner of the election was the nominee of the Bishop of Rome. But the power of Clement and Origen was so great that they would not allow this newly elected bishop to come to Alexandria and be ordained. So for a long time, Alexandria did not have a bishop because of this war between these fighting factions. Eventually, Clement died, the bishop was able to come into the city, and Origen was forced to flee. Where did Origen go? He went to Caesarea, and there he was eventually ordained a bishop as well. What an interesting occurrence in the wars of the bishops. Well, in the 4th century, we come to another major point that I wanted to discuss with you, the emergence of the imperial church. This is the time of Constantine, so let me set the scene for you. Diocletian was the emperor prior to Constantine. He wanted to draw the entire Roman Empire together in a unity of faith, and that unity of faith was to be pagan. Therefore, because the Christians would not agree to worship pagan gods, he began a system of persecution. And many, many Christians died during the tenure of Diocletian. But Diocletian resigned as principal emperor, and with his resignation, other officials were either forced to resign or chose to resign, and there ensued a period of chaos and internal war. Eventually, the leader of a group from Europe, Northern Europe, under the leadership of Constantine, won the battle that took over control of the Roman Empire. This great battle was fought at Milvian Bridge, a bridge over the Tiber River at Rome. There, Constantine's army, outnumbered, was to fight another claimant to the emperorship. And Constantine was the victor. When he won, he gave an edict of toleration, an edict of tolerance for all religions. But because he had fought under the sign of Christianity, Constantine clearly favored the Christian church. His mother, Helena, was a Christian and highly influential. From that moment on, the Christian church became the church to join, the religion of the empire. Constantine himself joined Christianity upon his deathbed, and every emperor after Constantine, save one, was a Christian. That means that all of the bureaucrats found that it was to their advantage to become a Christian. And we see tremendous and rapid growth, much of it politically driven. I don't think most of those people were truly converted to Christianity as a religion. They just saw it as a convenient way to get ahead. There was a need in Constantine's mind to stamp out this tremendous diversity that he found upon joining the Christian church that we have been discussing. Therefore, he decided that he would eliminate the ambiguity. He would fix on one set of doctrinal beliefs, and in that one set, he would find a unity of the faith. Therefore, Constantine called a group of bishops together in the city of Nicaea, not too far from his capital in Constantinople. And this council of bishops was to meet and decide on the doctrine of the church. About 300 bishops came from the east and from the west. There were some 1,800 invited, but about 300 were able to make it. The most important issue was Christology, that is, the nature of Christ. One of those bishops, named Athanasius, believed that Christ was uncreated and that he was one and the same substance as God. Another bishop at this time was Arian, the man that we've already spoken about in the Arianism. He believed that Christ was created and was from a distinct but similar substance as God. Well, of the bishops who came, the 300, 22 of them favored Arianism. Most of those changed their vote when they realized that they were on the losing side. Those who did not change were killed by order of the Emperor Constantine. Let's see how that's depicted in this video.
Eight months after Chrysopolis, Constantine forged ahead with his vision of a Christian empire by bringing together hundreds of bishops to work out a statement of belief which is still at the heart of Christianity today.
We have agreed a form of words. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty. We believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father. God from God, light from light. True God from true God. We believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We acknowledge one baptism for the remission of sins. We look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come.
God forgive you. God forgive you.
Amen.
Therefore, let's compare the Orthodox doctrine as defined by the Nicene Council, actually the doctrine that was ratified by the Emperor Constantine, and compare that to Mormonism. The number of gods, in the Trinitarian belief, there is only one God. In Mormonism, there are three, and they constitute one Godhead. The number of beings, that is, individuals, in the Trinitarian belief, there is only one. In the Mormon belief, there are three. The divisions of the divine substance, in the Trinitarian belief, they say there is no division. And in the Mormon belief, there are, of course, three separate substances: Christ, God, and the Holy Ghost. The number of persons, in the Trinitarian belief, they would say there are three persons, as do the Mormons. The difference, of course, is that in Trinitarian belief, those three persons are somehow not divided by substance, they are not divided into separate beings, and they are not divided into separate gods. They are somehow three in one, and that, of course, is the Trinity. Later, there was an Emperor Theodosius who made some important contributions to Christianity. He is the emperor who made Christianity the official state religion. Notice that he is only about a generation after Constantine. At that point, we can say that he made the Catholic Church the official state religion. And so the Catholic Church would really have its origin from Theodosius, although Catholics believe that they had their origin from Peter, and some other Catholics would say from Constantine. But I think that it's actually more accurate to say that the Catholic Church began with Theodosius. He made heresy against Christianity or against the Orthodox belief that became the Catholic belief. He made that a state crime. How well respected is he? Well, here we can see the front and the back of a coin that was minted under Valentinian. He was a co-ruler with Theodosius, and it shows those two emperors with halos over their head. Therefore, they assumed that, at least in their minds, they were very righteous men. Well, it is without a doubt that imperialism, that is, adoption of the Christian church as the state religion, caused the church to grow spectacularly. Here's a question for you. Do you think that's good for the church? Or do you think that was bad for the church? There are some interesting figures that we get on that point. Bart Ehrman, that professor at North Carolina, Chapel Hill, he says that during the first few centuries of the Christian church, the growth, though fairly rapid, was still at a rate that is understandable by today's standards. In fact, he says, the growth of the Catholic Church or the Christian church in the first few centuries almost exactly equaled the growth of the Mormon church in its first century or two. Therefore, we can see that early on, the Christian church and the Mormon church were growing by the same mechanisms, that is, baptisms of individuals. But after the imperial church was created by Constantine, the growth was incredibly rapid, and people joined the church simply because it was politically appropriate to do so. I think that that caused great problems in the Christian church, and that it certainly was an evidence of the acceleration of the apostasy. Well, let's talk about some of the key individuals within the church. One, of course, is Athanasius. The reason that I want to talk about him is because he did two very important things. First, we've already talked about it. He defined doctrine at the Council of Nicaea. He advocated that Christ is, his word, consubstantial with the Father, and of course Arianism taught that Christ is of a distinct substance from the Father. Another thing that Athanasius did is in AD 367, he is the first to lay out specifically which books should be incorporated into the New Testament. He defined the 27 books that we use in the New Testament today. Therefore, with his indication of those books, the process of canonization began. There was a lot of dispute about authenticity of some of those books, but nevertheless, his statement, he was very powerful, was the one that was adopted. Somewhat later, Jerome, a monk who decided it was his calling to translate all of those scriptures into Latin, gathered them together, and he went over to the Holy Land and there lived the rest of his life writing and translating these scriptures. He wrote them into the Latin language, and that was considered to be the vulgar language or the common language, and therefore his version of the Bible is called the Vulgate, and it was the version that was used throughout the Middle Ages. Now, I think we can legitimately ask a question about what is the nature of inspiration that would lead to these scriptures. What is the relationship of the writer to heavenly messages. Here are three interesting paintings that show us different interpretations. Take a look closely at this painting. It shows Matthew writing the scriptures. And notice that Matthew has an inkhorn in his left hand and a quill in his right. And the inkhorn, if you look closely, you can see that there is a line of ink that is going up through the inkhorn to the heavens, where an angel is putting the ink into the inkhorn. What that is saying is that somehow the ink of the angels is translated into the words of Matthew. Here's another painting. This was done in 1602 by Caravaggio, an Italian artist. And notice here again Matthew, and an angel is helping Matthew. And in this painting we can see that the hand of the angel is actually directing the hand of Matthew. And therefore it is not Matthew that is writing as much as the angel that is writing. That's a very literal view of the words of the New Testament. Interestingly, here is another painting by Caravaggio, somewhat later in the same year. Again, Matthew is writing, and an angel now stands in the air above him and whispers the words to Matthew. Somewhat less direct, not quite as much control as we see in the previous painting, but it is interesting to see these differing views of how precise the words of the angels or the inspiration of God would have proceeded to the canon. Eusebius gives us a very interesting point of view that I think we should consider here as well. Let's read what Eusebius says about some of these scriptures. He's talking about the books of John, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, and then also the book of Revelation, and also the Gospel of John. Eusebius says, by the phraseology, we can measure the difference between the Gospel of John and Epistle of John and the Revelation. The first two are written not only without any blunders in the use of Greek, but with remarkable skill as regards diction, logical thought, and orderly expression. It is impossible to find in them one barbarous word or solecism, that is an ungrammatical construct, or any kind of vulgarism. Going on, the other saw revelations and received knowledge and prophecy, I will not deny. But I observe that his language, that is, in the book of Revelation, and style are not really Greek. He uses barbarous idioms and is sometimes guilty of solecisms. There is no need to pick these out now, for I have not said these things in order to pour scorn on him. Do not imagine it, but solely to prove the dissimilarity between these books. Well, how is someone to treat the various books of the New Testament then in terms of authorship? It raises some questions that were never properly answered at the time the canon was made. Going on, Eusebius says, so it was that they, apostates, laid hands unblushingly on the Holy Scriptures, claiming to have corrected them. Either they do not believe that the inspired Scriptures were spoken by the Holy Spirit, if so, they are unbelievers, or they imagine that they are wiser than He. If so, can they be other than possessed? Here we see Eusebius commenting on the Scriptures and how even in his time, in the 4th century, people were intentionally altering the Scriptures. What a disaster. What a problem. No wonder we say that the Bible must be translated correctly. That probably means translated from the original text into its various copies as well. Another person that we should at least consider in the early Christian church is the Emperor Valentinian III. He decreed that all bishops should give their allegiance to the Bishop of Rome. He was very powerful. This was in the 5th century. And therefore, at this point, the Roman bishop became the principal bishop of the church, and at this time, the Roman bishop took the title of Pope, which means father. Simultaneously, there were dissenters, especially in the Greek part of the Roman Empire. And in those areas, there were national churches. There was an Egyptian church, there was a Syrian church, and there was a Greek church. Those churches each wanted to maintain their uniqueness, their nationality, if you like. And therefore, those Eastern churches formed a consortium, each with their bishops, but they refused to name any one of their bishops as being the father of all of the others, or the greatest of all of the others. They designated the Bishop of Constantinople as the first among equals. And therefore, in that Eastern tradition, we see the governance by these principal bishops from each of those countries. Interestingly enough, they also took the name of father, but they chose to call themselves patriarchs. So there was the Patriarch of Alexandria, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and other patriarchs as well. Well, from the 5th century on, we see some additional changes. First, there are more church councils to define various points of doctrine. These could be called by the Pope, or they might be called by the Emperor, because the Emperor is in charge of the church, but because the Emperor has so many political issues to deal with, he often lets the Pope take day-to-day control over the church. However, it is the Emperor who chooses who the popes are to be. Later on, we see that other people nominate the Pope, and the Emperor's position becomes one of ratification of the Pope, but nevertheless, the Emperor is viewed as being superior to the Pope throughout the Roman Empire period. Eventually, however, Rome fell to invading barbarians. In 476, the city of Rome fell, as well as the capital of the Western Empire, Ravenna. Authority was transferred away from Ravenna and given to the surviving emperor over in Constantinople, and barbarians took control of the West. From that point on, the western part of the empire was without an effective emperor, and therefore there was no strong leader in the West, and that became even worse as time progressed into the Dark Ages. The only political or organizational entity with any power at all was the Catholic Church, and the Pope was in charge. Therefore, he continued for a while under the direction from Constantinople, but he was pretty able to do whatever he wanted to do, and eventually he became the arbiter of everything in the West because there was no one else to check what he wanted. Now let's talk about a very important person with respect to doctrine. This person is Augustine. He lived from 354 to 430. He lived during the time of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. He was educated in classical Greek thought. He adopted a belief called Manichaeism and then rejected it. It was a kind of pagan belief. He then moved to the city of Milan, where he came under the influence of the Bishop of Milan, a man named Ambrose, now known as Saint Ambrose. And Ambrose converted Augustine, and then Augustine moved back to North Africa, where he had come from, and he moved into the city of Hippo, where he became the bishop of that city. Augustine is remembered to us first because of his writings, and the most important of those initially was a book called Confessions, which means speaking together, and in that book he related his own conversion. Very powerful book, very influential in teaching people about Christianity. Then, when the city of Rome was sacked by barbarians, people came to St. Augustine and asked him, how could that possibly be that the city of God would be sacked by these barbarians, and how could God allow that to be? Then Augustine wrote a book called The City of God. And in that book, he talked about the history of the world from a Christian point of view, an incredibly powerful book. And in this book, he pointed out that there are really two cities of God. The principal city of God is really the city of God in heaven. And the earthly city of God is really just a place where God's church happens to be located, but it is not a holy city by any means. It is just a political city that God has chosen momentarily to have as the headquarters of His church. Therefore, it's not inconsistent for God to allow Rome to be sacked, perhaps even appropriate if Rome is full of crime and sin. So the two cities of earth and God constantly fight amongst themselves because the one in heaven is trying to get the one on earth to behave properly, and those on earth do so reluctantly. The city of God, therefore, is spiritual, defined by the hearts of the people, much as the concept of Zion within the LDS belief. After Augustine and this incredibly brilliant treatise on doctrine as well as the nature of the church, we have some very interesting doctrines that emerged and lasted throughout the Middle Ages. The first is the nature of God. He indicated that God was non-corporeal, and that came from Plato's philosophy. Augustine was strongly Platonic. He defined the resurrection and indicated that even though it was thought that the resurrection brought forth a physical body, that was actually only temporary, and that Christ then left his physical body and ascended to heaven as a spiritual essence. And then he articulated clearly the belief of the Trinity, that is, three separate entities merged to one, and that became the foundation, the philosophical foundation for the Trinity. He also talked about man's potential. He said that man is inherently evil through original sin. He has no concept of man becoming like God, that is the concept of exaltation. And he believes that God alone chooses who he will save, that it is only God's will, and therefore predestination of mankind is the way that God would save those who he chooses to save. Now let's talk about early monasticism, because it's also a very important part of the church that grew, especially during these early years and then into the Middle Ages. There was a man who lived in Egypt named St. Anthony, a good man, and he was sick of the urban problems associated with the Roman Empire in this latter period, and therefore he went out in the desert and began to live as a hermit. People really liked him, and they went out and started to live nearby. And then he moved further away, and they liked him still and moved closer. So poor St. Anthony was never able to get away from people, but he did define some of the ways that a hermit could live and find personal salvation. There were some people who followed St. Anthony who became extremists. Some believed that they should give up all meat. In fact, they actually started to eat grass. They became graziers, that is, tried to live like ruminating animals. And there is one man who lived on a tower, and he would stand on one foot for hours and hours and hours, and stay on the tower night and day for years. A very interesting method of demonstrating his denial of personal comfort, which he thought would get him salvation. Eventually, there was a man named St. Cyril who lived in Syria, who wrote down a set of rules for how to live a monastic life. And these rules became adopted by the Eastern Church as the regular, that is, rules or regula of the clergy in the eastern part of the Christian church. Later, a man named Saint Benedict, who lived in Italy, gave another set of rules, and those were the rules that were largely defined monasticism within the Catholic Church. There were also many who not just tolerated but sought actively for martyrdom, and they believed that they would be those who reached heaven. And there was also at this time a definition or a preference for celibacy. We don't see that from the original church. It emerged some 4 or 5 centuries later. So what is the impact of early Christianity on Western civilization? Certainly, there is political rule by kings. Second, there is wonderful art that expresses many of these beliefs. And it was that art that pulled us through the Dark Ages and medieval period, most of that art being Christian in nature. There was wonderful literature written about Christianity, like Dante and Milton, and they do many things that define the Christian faith. There are educational institutions like universities that are at their origin Christian in nature. There were wars. The Crusades come immediately to mind, and then after the Protestant Reformation, the 30 Years' War and other wars of religion. So not all of the legacy of Christianity is good. Christianity influenced colonialization in the Americas. The Americas were seen as a fruitful missionary ground for early Christian teachers. And finally, of course, the wonderful influence on architecture. Some of the beautiful Gothic cathedrals would be built to glory and honor of God. Well, early Christianity, a very important part of our history, one that changed a lot. Not only did the church change, but that church changed the world. Thank you for being with me today. Appreciate it.